Before Europe decided to get its rulers out, Africa was a shockingly complex place. It was filled with empires, kingdoms, city-states, and all sorts of political structures. You had the Ashanti Empire in West Africa, the vast Sokoto Caliphate, the Kingdom of Congo, and the Zulu Kingdom in the south. These were places with intricate trade routes, sophisticated art, and political systems that had been working for centuries. A real headache, frankly, if your plan is to walk in and claim that you discovered everything. The popular 19th century European view was of a dark continent, which was a wonderfully convenient way to ignore the millions of people who already lived there. It's much easier to justify taking things when you pretend the original owners don't really count, or better yet, that they don't even exist. The starting gun for this whole mess was fired by one man with an oversized ambition and an undersized country. King Leopold II of Belgium looked at his small nation and decided he needed a colony, not for Belgium, but for himself. He founded something called the International African Association in 1876, cloaking his land grab in the language of humanitarianism and anti-slavery efforts, a truly noble cause. This private venture, which he called the Congo Free State, was about 76 times larger than Belgium. It was his personal property. Think of it less as a country and more as the world's largest, most brutal rubber plantation. His methods for civilizing the locals involved quotas for rubber and ivory, enforced with a level of cruelty that even other colonial powers found a bit much, and that's saying something. Leopold's little project made everyone else nervous. Not because of the human rights abuses, of course. They were nervous he was getting all the good stuff before they could. So, to prevent an ungentlemanly scuffle, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called a meeting, the Berlin Conference of 1884. Imagine a party where 14 nations, mostly European, show up to carve up a cake they didn't bake in a house they don't own. And the people who baked the cake and owned the house, they weren't invited. It would just be awkward. For 3 months, these men debated the finer points of colonial claims over brandy and cigars in a palace in Berlin. They weren't partitioning Africa itself at this meeting, but they were writing the official rule book for how to do it politely, a civilized framework for continent-wide theft. The main rule they agreed upon was the principle of effective occupation, a wonderfully vague and self-serving concept. To claim a piece of coastal Africa, you had to notify the other signatory powers and prove you could actually administer the area. How do you prove that? You build a fort, have some soldiers wander around, maybe fly a flag. This naturally kicked off a frantic race. European explorers, missionaries, and soldiers fanned out across the continent to plant flags on anything that didn't move. The interior was even easier. All you had to do was get a local chief to sign a treaty. The actual content of the treaty was, shall we say, flexible. It was basically a continental game of capture the flag, but with treaties written in legalese and consequences that would last for centuries. A truly organized approach to chaos. Once the claims were staked, the map drawing began in earnest. Back in Europe, of course, and the tool of choice for nation building, apparently, was the ruler. Look at a modern map of Africa. Notice all those suspiciously straight lines? The border between Egypt and Sudan is just a line. So is the one between Libya and Chad. This is because the people drawing them had no idea what was actually there. Mountains, rivers, ancient tribal lands, trade routes? Irrelevant details. The Gambia is a country that exists as a thin sliver of land on either side of a river purely because that's as far as British gunboats could travel from the coast. My personal favorite is the Caprivi Strip in Namibia, a bizarre panhandle created so Germany could have access to the Zambezi River. They later discovered the river wasn't navigable there. A brilliant piece of planning. The treaties used to justify effective occupation were masterpieces of creative interpretation. European agents would arrive in a village, find someone they decided was a king, and present him with a complex legal document in English or French. Often, the local leader had no concept of private land ownership in the European sense. Signing away your land was like signing away the air. In 1888, agents of Cecil Rhodes famously presented King Lobengula of the Ndebele people with the Rudd concession. They told him he was granting them permission to dig a few holes for minerals. What he actually signed away was exclusive mining rights to his entire territory. In return, 1,000 rifles, 100,000 rounds of ammunition, and a steamboat. A steamboat on a river that was mostly unnavigable. You start to see a pattern here.
The logical outcome of drawing lines without looking is that you cut things in half. Important things, like people. The Maasai people found themselves split between German East Africa and British East Africa, now Kenya and Tanzania. The Yue people were divided between the German colony of Togoland, the British Gold Coast, and French Dahomey. Suddenly, your cousin who lives in the next village is technically in another country, ruled by a different European power with different laws and a different language. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. It destroyed traditional social structures, disrupted pastoral routes, and created instant artificial minorities in newly formed colonies. It's like taking a beautifully complex puzzle, throwing it on the floor, and then forcing the pieces from different corners to fit together. Spoiler alert, they don't. If you want a textbook example of this cartographic madness, look at Nigeria. It wasn't a country, it was an administrative convenience. The British diplomat Frederick Lugard was instrumental in cobbling it together. In 1914, Britain amalgamated the Southern Nigeria Protectorate and the Northern Nigeria Protectorate. Why? Because the northern part wasn't paying for itself, and the south, with its palm oil trade, was. It was a purely economic decision. The fact that they were mashing together over 250 distinct ethnic groups, including the predominantly Muslim House of Fulani in the north and the largely Christian Igbo and Yoruba in the south, was a problem for another day. These groups had different histories, languages, religions, and political systems. The British just drew a line around them all and called it Nigeria. Creating a stable, unified nation out of that was left as an exercise for the future inhabitants. Good luck to them. It's important to remember that Africans didn't just sit back and watch this happen. There was widespread resistance. Samori Toure, founder of the Wasulu Empire, fought the French for years in West Africa. The Mahadist War in Sudan was a massive uprising against Anglo-Egyptian rule. But these resistance movements faced a significant technological disadvantage. A well-organized army with spears is still at a disadvantage against one with machine guns. The great exception, the one that proves the rule, was Ethiopia under Emperor Menelik II. At the Battle of Adwa in 1896, his forces decisively defeated an invading Italian army. He had spent years acquiring modern weapons and uniting his country. Italy was humiliated and Ethiopia secured its sovereignty. It was a stunning victory that showed what was possible, but for most, it was a tragic demonstration of what they were up against. Running these new, arbitrarily shaped colonies was a nightmare. So the colonial powers took a shortcut: indirect rule. Find a local ethnic group that seems cooperative, give them power and privileges, and let them help you govern the others. This was a fantastically effective way to create lasting resentment and ethnic tension. In Rwanda, the Belgians elevated the Tutsi minority over the Hutu majority, measuring their skulls and noses to create a pseudo-scientific racial hierarchy. This decision had some minor, horrifying consequences down the line. By formalizing and weaponizing ethnic identities that had previously been more fluid, the colonial powers planted seeds of division that would grow into forests of conflict. They weren't just drawing lines on maps, they were drawing lines between people, turning neighbors into rivals. It was efficient, cheap, and utterly devastating. Then came the mid-20th century and the winds of change. The colonies started gaining independence. Finally, a chance to fix the mess, right? A chance to redraw the borders along more logical, ethnic, or historical lines. But the newly independent African leaders faced an impossible choice. Trying to redraw the map would mean opening a Pandora's box of conflicting claims, potentially sparking endless wars across the entire continent. So, in 1964, the newly formed Organization of African Unity made a fateful decision. They passed a resolution agreeing to respect the colonial borders as they existed at the time of independence. They essentially chose to accept the poison of the colonial map rather than risk the unknown cure of redrawing it. It was a pragmatic decision born of a terrible inheritance. They were stuck with the house the colonizers had built, no matter how badly designed it was. So, what's the legacy of this 19th century European arts and crafts project? Well, it's still with us. The arbitrary borders are a direct cause or a major contributing factor in countless conflicts. The Nigerian Civil War, the Eritrean War of Independence, the conflicts in Sudan. They create nations with no coherent national identity and trap ethnic groups in states they don't want to be part of. This isn't to say every problem in modern Africa is Europe's fault. That's simplistic. But it is to say that you cannot understand the political landscape of the continent without understanding the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of those men who gathered in Berlin. They drew lines on a map to solve a European problem, creating a century of African ones in the process. It remains, perhaps, the most consequential and poorly thought out piece of cartography in human history. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!